Hello and welcome to another edition of Backstage. I'm pretty excited about this one. I'm chatting to a good friend of mine, a guy that I met first back in, I reckon it was around 2007 again, same as Brian Nygaard. He's a former cyclist. He's a two-time Kiwi champion. At one point, he was regarded as the best lead-out man in the world, and he also had the best resting stink eye of all the riders in the pro peloton. I'm talking about Julian Dean, who then transitioned with the team Green Edge into more of a sports director role. He was also on Avant course, so he'd check out all the road conditions. We'd mix it with the fans. Many great memories. Jules joins us from Rotorua. Jules, how are you travelling in lockdown at the moment, mate?
Yeah, good. You know, I'm a bit of an introvert in my personality, so just been enjoying some time here with the family. Getting out, we've got a bit of land around our place, so we've been busy enough and trying to keep the kids out of each other's hair and out of our hair, and they've been good. They've been started their own wrestling club, which they've got two members, both brothers. so that's
So
been
Fight
good.
Club.
That's right. Yeah. Fight club at the Dean's house. But no, they're good. It's been good, and it's actually kind of weird, you know, like you're so busy with stuff all the time, and it's been, I guess, for us as a family, and you know, running kids to sports and music and different things, and me being away in Europe and different bits and pieces. Just been trying to embrace the time and slow down a little bit. So just been trying to think about it positively in that regard.
Do you find that you're saying that you're obviously on a bit of land and you are a bit of an introvert at times, but that transition hasn't been as hard for yourself? Do you know of people that are really struggling? Because we're, about a month or so into lockdown now, the ones that are sort of used to being social and on the go all the time. Do you know anyone that's sort of like that is struggling?
Yeah, my wife.
Is she at her limit now? Is she like, nah, I don't know, I can't see how I'm going to get through another month of this?
Well, I don't know. Like when she started talking to the chickens, I'm starting to wonder, mate, if she's at her limit. I guess so.
I spoke to Brian Nygaard about a week ago, and a lot of it was around, you know, the state of cycling and so forth. I don't want to harp on it too much, but how's the general mood within the team, and what's the biggest things that people are sort of concerned about at the moment?
I think, you know, there's, you know, obviously like any organisation in cycling, there's multiple layers to everything. There's you know, there's sponsors, and then there's team management, and then there's athletes as well. And I think every sort of layer has got sort of its own concerns and own fears about going forward. But I think the one thing that generally ties it all together is just the uncertainty of these times. You know, we don't know when we're racing next. All the races have been cancelled now, up to the Tour de France, which was scheduled to start on the 27th of June. But you know, the tricky thing is that, you know, you've got guys in different parts of the world. Some guys are able to train, some guys aren't, and you know, we don't even still know if we're going to be able to race the Tour de France in starting in June, which I very much doubt it. That I would see it's going to be postponed. But I think it's just that level of uncertainty, and it's not just in cycling. It's everybody's. I think it's everybody's fear, because that uncertainty creates vulnerability. And you know, I think we spend all our lives trying to become less vulnerable, for better or for worse.
So, how have you gone trying to sort of keep riders motivated? You know, what are some of the things you talk to these guys about in this period? As you know, like, you know, they don't know when they're going to race again.
Yeah, I think, you know, there's not. I think you know, the key thing in this whole process is, you know, only really making decisions on what you know, and there's not a lot that you know. And you know, anyone that knows anything about sport will know that, you know, it's about planning, it's about preparation. You know, you plan your season out, you have peak periods in your season. You know, you have times you plan your training out where you're doing base training. You know, as management in the Mitchelton-Scott organisation, we plan our season out to key events that our sponsors want us to perform in. But all that's gone out the window because there's so much uncertainty. So the key message that, you know, and we've been working pretty hard on that the last week or so, because these guys, especially those guys in Italy and Spain, they've been going to be locked down for a month coming up at the end of next week, and they're still going to have 2 more weeks of being in lockdown. So, it's just, for us, it's actually been about not trying to predict too much about when you're going to come back to racing, because that stuff's really going to be out of our control or out of their control. And it's just about, breaking it down, bringing the goals or the expectations in a bit closer to what you're going to be in control of. So the next sort of phase will be in 3 weeks' time when they can come out of lockdown. What can they do between now and then? And and you see plenty of this stuff around on the internet, recommendations from social scientists and psychologists and performance people and management people, is it's just basically real basic stuff, like having that daily routine, controlling the controllables, and having a list and ticking a list off. So it's all pretty simple stuff, but when you're in these times of uncertainty, especially high performance athletes, they really want to be able to control everything, and that's probably what makes them high performance athletes in many regards. But certainly they need to let that go a little bit.
You're talking about, it's obviously vulnerable times for cyclists and staff and everyone involved, but has this really exposed, like we've been saying about for years, the issues with just the structure of how this sport's run? I mean, you look at any other sport, if it's all governed under the one body, well, say, for example, in Australia with AFL, the teams are supported by the league with this sort of cash injection as a fallback. But teams, I mean, what support do teams have in a time like this? They're pretty much sort of left to their own devices, given that the structure is, it just feels like it's every man for themselves, which there's no kitty. Where's the kitty that's just been sitting there generated from revenues with TV and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, this exposes cycling and some of the flaws in its structure really, really badly, and it has created a lot of uncertainty then in a sport, because cycling teams get no money from TV revenue or the like. There's no gate takings, anything like that. It's just the team sponsors. And that's all, and each team is its own entity. They operate completely by themselves. There's no cohesion at all. So it's exactly what you're saying, Jonesy, is that a situation like this where there's so much uncertainty, we don't know when we're going to race next. The race organisers are making decisions on their own about when they're going to be able to put their races on. Teams are making decisions about how they're managing their riders through this period, and it just makes it really hard. But I think also this is potentially a good time for the sport to review itself and have a look and say, well, we've known these issues for a long time. This situation's really exposed us. Are we just going to keep our head in the sand, get our head buried in the sand and go on? Or is this an opportunity for change? And, change only comes about by 2 reasons. You get a collective mass of to instigate a change, such as some sort of revolution or something like that, or a catastrophic event. And it's pretty hard in cycling to get a mass cohesion to instigate change, but certainly a catastrophic event is upon us. So I really think that if this change doesn't happen now, and we get a more coercive approach between the teams, the race organisers and sponsors and the like going forward, then it certainly won't happen in our lifetime.
It's if that's going to happen, that's going to happen pretty soon, in terms of, like, there might not be a handful of teams in the space of a couple of months. I mean, do they need to all get together now and say, hey, guys, we need to collectively work out, well, what is the plan if we sort of almost write off 2020, how's 2021 look? And do they restructure a sponsors package almost looking to next season sooner rather than later? Because even when the smoke does clear, I mean, the backlog of races and organised, as you said, they're all doing and fighting their own sort of agenda. I mean, it's just going to be a massive cluster, yeah?
Yeah, it's really hard. So how do you go about instigating that sort of change, and what's the first step in that process? And I think, if you think a bit more deeply about stuff, and when we use this analogy, when we're preparing athletes for races, and let's say we're aiming for the Vuelta a España or the Tour de France, and we have all our lead-up races, and we always talk about this thing, what we call the process, going through the process and setting the targets aside in those lead-up races, getting the process right, so when it comes to the big time or the big target event, we know what we've got to go through and how to action the plan. So going back to what you're talking about, I think that really, it's not going to be an overnight change that necessarily needs to happen. And that won't happen because there's too many stakeholders that have got too many varying interests. So I really think that what has to happen is it just has to instigate the process and highlight the need for things to be different, to protect all the teams, to protect all the races, and start working on that process, and it's tough, improving the process is sort of the Cinderella of challenger management. It's really difficult thing to instigate and to keep focused on. But I think in the first instance, what's got to happen is, so much of the time when you get involved in trying to improve the process, you get too focused on the targets at the end. So if you're a team coming back and you get focused, let's say the Tour de France happens in August, you get focused on that and you forgo all the things you need to go through to improve that process for the greater good, because your sponsors are setting demands for this year's Tour de France. So this is where you can get off track. So there needs to be a much longer term view on how this should play out and how this should lead to improvements for everyone: sponsors, teams, riders, race management.
It just feels like there's no real captain of the ship at the moment in terms of like who do people turn to for leadership. Like in countries, we go to our prime minister. In cycling, do you go to UCI? Well, they've taken on the ASO before and they haven't really won many of those battles. Or do you just sign with the ASO and pretty much go, well, that's where our sponsors' money are going? What do you want us to do? I mean, you're sort of stuck in no man's land.
Yeah, it is really hard. It'd be easy if someone came in with a whole bunch of money and could set a league down or buy up all the rights to everything. I think that would certainly make our process going forward much easier. But I can't see that happening, and certainly not in today's current economic climate.
It's a shame that Bill Gates is obsessed with ping pong and not cycling. Because if Bill Gates could come in and go, righto, clean house, I'm going to do my own thing. Like someone with the deepest pockets could come in and go, right, I'm going to just do this whole season properly. Like it seems like whoever's got the money and the vision, it's at that point where I think they need to start, well, from an outsider's perspective, they need to stop going, okay, well, it'll probably be July, probably August. Good chances are, if you listen to any of the experts, it's going to be pretty much write the year off. Even if they do let them out, I mean, it's going to provide so many issues till they get a vaccine. Almost write it off, start from scratch and start planning for next year. So once the smoke does clear, I mean, with this will totally change even the way riders are paid and the structure, because we're seeing it with other codes, excess staff and the nice to haves. I mean, they're pretty much going to be gone because people are going to be, spending where it's like, I don't know if we can afford that. I don't know. I don't know if you're going to see a 3-story food truck parked in the car parks anymore, Jules.
No, that's right. And if you take like a Bora, they're not going to be selling as many kitchens for a while. And those are just some of the examples. Sunweb's a travel company. They're not going to be selling too many trips anywhere. They're certainly not going to be selling any tickets on cruise ships, I don't reckon.
No, for sure not.
But it's complex, professional cycling's big money, it's big interest. But I think it's time to take a step back, and there's been lots of shifts, I think, in cycling over the years in the way that teams have gone about their business and the way that they've invested in their athletes. And invested in the teams themselves. But maybe, some of that investment needs to come out of the athletes and some of the organisations, and go back into creating the competition or the league or the races that create a story throughout the year. But it's not an easy. It's hard, because everyone's going to come out of this and they're going to just be, they're going to be scrambling just to keep their own little enterprise together.
I sort of getting back to cyclist wages. Shout out to all the cyclists if you're listening. It felt like when Oleg Tinkov come on board and was willing to pay whatever for guys like Sagan and Contador, it felt like that was just the inflation that, looking back now, that the sport, I think it's really cost the structure, because it meant that the top end teams just could not compete with the massive budgets. And in times of crisis now, it just feels that if you had your time again, even with some sort of structure around a salary cap or something around that, so that it made it a little bit more of an even keel. And in times like crisis, you can actually survive the whole brand, rather than, there may only be 4 or 5 teams that can survive this.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a reality, and certainly, there's been, when private investors or people with a lot of money came into the cycling world, it did change things a lot in the way that I think teams went about their business. But I think that's still a survivable model. And it could actually be a way forward almost for the teams as well. But I think cycling as a sport as well has grown quite a lot globally, and there's a lot of interest, especially for bike companies, to have key riders on bikes. And when you take the likes of Trek and Contador and Specialized with Sagan, and now McLaren with Cav, and those sorts of associations, those enterprises are paying big money to have those athletes associated with those bike brands as well. So, and that wasn't the case 10 years ago. That sort of, I think that really came about with Lance Armstrong and Trek, that association. And I think, I don't know the figures off the top of my head, but I recall seeing something one time, and when Lance was riding Trek bikes, the massive boost that had to their profits. So, those sorts of things.
He was filthy with Trek when it all went to shit, because he took them from a company that was, struggling to sell a handful of bikes to obviously an industry leader. So you look at the global sales, as you said, like now.
Yeah.
What I wanted to ask you was, how much has it changed for a young rider, say when you came on the scene in 96, 97, to a young rider coming on the scene today? And how much harder is that to manage from a team's perspective with the support that you need to give?
I think definitely it's changed. Well, it has changed a lot. Before, when it was the sort of likes of myself and Stewie O'Grady and that sort of era, Robbie McEwen and Hank Vogels, when we were coming into Europe and looking for contracts, we were just happy to be there, and we had to battle to get and fight to get our places on teams in big races like the Tour de France, to get on those teams that were racing those races. Now, there's a massive market of rider agents and rider managers, and part of what they do now is identify young talent. So they've got sort of 16 and 17-year-olds that they identify through national programs, through national track programs, national road programs, and they're on the scout all the time, as we are as teams as well. A big part of our job, and this is where someone like Matt White is so great, is these guys are looking at these under 23 races all the time, and it's almost a battle. And this is one of the other battles that's escalated between teams, is to get hold of this young talent, before anyone else does, and get them on pre-contracts and get them schooled into signed up to your team or wanting to come to your team before they're even ready to turn pro. So, you just have to show now, a little bit of class at a junior world championships, at a, one of the big international junior tours, or some good under 23 results. And, you're going to have a pathway into a world tour team, which is going to be, crafted a little bit by these rider managers or agents, whatever they like to call themselves. So there's no essential hard graft and having to prove yourself in smaller pro races before you get to these big teams like there used to be, which is
how important
good.
is that as a life learning lesson to go through that experience where you sort of have to find your own feet just from trial and error and getting those sort of lessons given to you?
Yeah, I think like one of the key components, I think, and this is just humanity in general, I reckon, is always having a sense of vulnerability, and not knowing if, I think by not knowing everything all the time, or not everything being a certainty, I think it just, is better for your human development or your personal development. And I think sort of what happens now, basically, as you deal with that vulnerability as a young person, as we sort of did coming through, you learn more about yourself. You learn more about the ways of the world, how things operate, expectations. You learn that that you have rights, but you also have responsibilities and obligations. And I think that in some ways, what sort of happens, and I think you see this a lot in some of those American sports where they graft those kids from high school into college teams and their pathways sort of set for them, and then you hear about them falling off the rails afterwards, because they haven't, although there hasn't been enough sort of life lessons, which essentially come from vulnerability. I think that's a key part of humanity, is learning how to deal with those sort of situations.
Have you found that a lot? You mentioned the college system. They put a lot of emphasis on the parents. So when they go to draft kids, they go and sit down, meet with the parents, and they're pretty much asking more questions to the olds than the actual athlete themselves. And that is because you learn a lot about the personality of this kid based on the upbringing that they've had. I mean, does that happen much in cycling? And have you actually seen, far out, we could have joined the dots a little bit better based on what we could have learnt from the environment?
Yeah, I think that sort of thing's not happening. I don't know that it's happening in cycling. But I don't know, when we had Peter Barnes back in the Orica Greenedge days, he was the doctor for Port Adelaide, was he, Jonesy?
Yeah.
Barnesy? Yeah.
Yep.
And I think AFL does that, don't they? They're quite
Yep.
big on doing that sort of background research into athletes as well, to try and find out their triggers or their hooks,
It's a bit of a dickhead test, really. I mean, if you've got a parent that's like, "Oh, my son is a superstar," I mean, that's a red flag. But if you get someone like Durbo's old man to be like, "Oh yeah, no, he has a go," but and talks it down, I mean, you're going to learn a lot.
Yeah, I think you do learn a lot, and obviously, I don't think you would have to be pretty careful. You would learn a lot, but I think it would be wrong as well sometimes to pigeonhole the kid solely based on that information. So it would give you a leg up, I reckon, and a start. But I think, as a professional organisation, what would be good sometimes, and this is sort of those rough diamonds that you get, I suppose, that you can help someone develop a little bit better and become a better person and a more complete person if they've got that physical talent. But I guess that parent interview would probably give you some of those triggers that you might need to work on.
We were talking off air the other day about your son, Tanner, is going to the same school as Buell's, and some of the things that they're instilling into these young blokes. Do you want to give us a bit of an insight on that and how important that is for their development?
Yeah, I think, like as a parent, and I think, like generally as you go through life, you're able to put more pieces of the life puzzle or whatever you want to call it together a little bit, And, my oldest now, he's just about to turn 15, so he's at his second year in high school. And he decided that he wanted to go to an all-boys school, Rotorua Boys High School here in Rotorua.
Is that because there's more fight clubs there, or just general, like the school?
Nah, he said because there's no chicks there, he didn't have to put hair gel on his hair in the morning, so he get 10 minutes extra sleep.
As I said, you can learn a lot from their parents.
That's right. But it's what's been awesome, and me and Carol, my wife, we were neither here nor there. That's sort of the school that he wanted to go to, and it's a 70% Maori population or Maori component to that school. So, if you take that, I think about 10 to 15% of the New Zealand population is Maori. So this is a predominantly a Maori boys' school, and the other 30% is what they call other. So that could be some Pacific Islanders and a few Pākehā kids as well. But what's been interesting is just watching what it means for a boy to go to a boys' school. And I think, some of the great All Black coaches or great rugby coaches that have come out of New Zealand were often headmasters at boys' schools. And Graham Henry, who was previous to Steve Hansen, who Steve Hansen was under, was a headmaster of one of the big schools in Auckland. And you just start to realise that these people, they're good managers, but they're good managers of young people. And when you go see the boys at that boys' school, as a sort of 14 or 15-year-old, there's not a place in the world that you actually feel more comfortable, although it's sort of somewhat hierarchical and sometimes a little bit intimidating. It's kind of what like a male man needs, I think, at that age. And it's been a really interesting process. And going back to Sam Bewley, he went to the same school. And one of the things that I've seen Sam develop in Mitchelton-Scott team over the years is this sort of leadership role that he's evolved into. And I know we've talked about guys in the team over the years, Jonesy, that we'd take that guy to the trenches or that guy to the trenches. And I think Bewley was in that sort of guys, that analogy that we'd take him to the trenches sort of thing. And what I see, they have a strong brotherhood emphasis at that school, and just being part of that school, part of that group. And I mean, that sort of exists quite a lot in Māori culture anyway. And but it's just such a good environment for boys. And if you can get your kids to come out of those sorts of years, I think with that, they might not even have the skills to be like maybe a Sam Bewley is, but if they know what it's like to be part of that group, I think that's really, really key in anything you do going forward in life. And especially if you in a high performance situation, whether it be the military or a sports team or whatever, those have got to be skills that you carry for the rest of your life, and it can apply to many different situations. And I remember Bewley telling me a story about how when he won his bronze medal at the Olympic Games, and you can ask him this if you get him on a podcast again, Jonesy, is about when he went back to Rotorua Boys High School, and he went up on the stage, and the whole school did the haka for him in the school, and he said it was just such an exhilarating feeling, going back and one of the proudest moments that he had, being able to show his Olympic medal. So that stuff I reckon is key. And if you think about a lot of the rugby schools around the country, I think that's the sort of culture they operate out of, and I think goes back that far.
What is it about the All Blacks culture that it become almost the it phrase, wasn't it? 4 or 5 years ago when that book came out. I mean, what were the key components from that culture from the All Blacks that made them so dominant?
I think there's a lot of one-liners or shit that came out of that book, which I thought was a bit bullshitting a bit over the top, maybe, but definitely has some.
Any specifics? Like, what are the general statements that you don't agree with that came out from that?
Well, I thought it was just a little bit. I'm sure all that stuff goes on in the All Blacks changing rooms or dressing rooms, however you want to frame it. But I just think that stuff's really situational, and it depends so much on the group that you've got, and being able to implement a lot of that stuff on every sports team that you're associated with certainly wouldn't fly. And I think, basically what the good message out of that book was to really understand where your athletes have come from, who your athletes are, and try and adhere to what sort of qualities have made them good athletes, and that's what, that whole stuff about sweeping the changing rooms out after training or whatever. Like, people think, that's a humility thing, but it's not actually about that. I reckon it's more about just identifying back to where you came from. That goes back to the stuff about the schools and what goes on in the schools and some of these, rugby culture schools. And I think it's more to do with identifying with that sort of stuff than it is actually about, making humility within that group at the time. It's a little bit re-establishing that connection,
It's funny you mention that, because an interesting story similar to the example you just gave was the San Antonio Spurs when they were taking on the Miami Heat. I think they were the underdogs for the NBA Finals. And they copped an injury, I think, to one of their key players. And Greg Popovich, the coach, he knew, oh, shit, it's going to be my bench that is going to win this championship. So I'm going to need guys like Patty Mills to stand up. And so what he did is, before one of the games, he stopped the guys and said, listen, I want to talk to you for 5 minutes about a guy called Eddie Marbo. And it was all about Eddie Marbo in Australia and, land title and all this sort of stuff, because that day was Marbo Day. And he knew that Patty Mills was really passionate Indigenous athlete. And Patty Mills reckons that it just blew him away, took him to another level. And then in the deciding game 6, Patty Mills shot 20 points. They win the championship. How important is that as a manager, not just of athletes, of people, to know the right moments to instill that confidence, or just to show that you actually give a shit?
Yeah, and that, that goes back to what we're talking about before, is about, our natural instinct, actual human instinct, is to steer away from vulnerability and do everything that we can to sort of get away from it, right? And one of the primary things that we do, I think, as humans is seek connection. And when we can make connections, we feel less vulnerable, right? And, I think anytime, if you're a good coach, and it's not about tactics and it's not about strategies, it's almost about that exact situation that you were talking about then, was taking away someone's feeling of vulnerability. If you had to throw Patty Mills out there on the court and ask him to score 20 points because they're in deep shit, he would have felt really exposed and vulnerable. But he's created that connection, which, alleviates some of that vulnerability, gives you a little bit of who you are and where you've come from, and takes that, if you want to call it, pressure or vulnerability away. And that's why I think it's really important that, as much as we have athletes that have been identified now from a young age, it's really important that they learn to embrace vulnerability. And as teams and managers, you invest in it a little bit. You invest in making people feel a little bit uncomfortable at times, because I think when it comes to the big plays, that capacity to be able to deal with that is going to work in your favour.
So was that the mindset going into the 2018 Vuelta? Because the backstory of that is the team had come close to winning a Grand Tour, second at the Giro, top 4, top 5s at the Tour and Vuelta and all that sort of stuff. going into it, you've got the Yates boys having a crack. Simon's your main guy, but the mental game. I mean, how did you shuffle those things up? And talking about the vulnerability, how'd you tackle those sort of things?
Yeah, that situation like really exposed itself, and because if you go back to that Giro, that was where Simon had the jersey already for 2 weeks, and then I think with 2 days to go or 3 days to go, Froome launched that bomber, and the race blew apart, and Simon lost everything. When he was smashing everyone in that 18 days beforehand, it was a given he was going to win the Giro, and so that exposed him really, really deeply. And there was word, it's going to take him a year to get over that. So devastating. I think he'd won a couple of stages already. Esteban had won a stage. The team had been just smashing it. And so, in terms of managed, when we came to the Vuelta, he didn't even want to ride the Vuelta, because he was just sort of, I guess, like that, devastated. But the thing is, he had every capacity to win that Giro, but he didn't manage it that well, because his personality, he normally eliminates his vulnerability by stamping on people when he's going well, showing it, talking it up, and that's how he placates his vulnerability. So it was a little bit really of just getting him to understand that by being, good, conserving, having 2 fingers up your nose, riding up the hill, looking at your opponents earlier on in the race, that's you can still use that as a tool to negate your vulnerability. But you've just got to internalize it, So it's about like, and if you know the Yateses or both the Yateses, or you've worked with them, that they're sort of quite brash and not afraid to sort of punch ahead with stuff.
I'd never seen riders come in the bus afterwards and show like zero amount of fear post-race to any of the hitters in GC. Like, they'd be so dirty that such and such went up the road, and you're like, shit, man, he's like a world champion, like he's a gun. But there's just this sort of, no, I should be there, and they're so pissed off within themselves, and how much can that pile up for these sort of guys? Like, if they're in that mindset where they're getting frustrated and they're starting to really, as you said, want to punch on, I mean, how can that really screw up a GC ambition?
Oh, it can do it massively, and the whole strategy that you need to have going into these 3-week races is exactly that. You've got to keep the long game in mind, and you've got to manage yourself early on, and manage yourself with confidence. There's going to be days when you're not feeling so good, but you've got to just sort of mitigate your losses a little bit on those days, and know that when you have those days, it's not the end of the world, and you're not going to smash everyone every day for the first 10 days. And installing that confidence that if you do smash everyone every day for the first 10 days, you're going to pay for it in the last 5. So it was just making sure that he was never going to forget what happened in the Giro, but it's just getting control of that emotion on the bike. And, it's a little bit that's sort of separating out the athlete and the person, and bringing more of this person who Simon Yates is into the athlete.
In the time at Greenedge, I saw a couple of different sort of director styles. In terms of GC, it was obviously Whitey and Steve-O, both totally different ends of the spectrum. Whitey's obviously passionate, lives and breathes it, and brings that across and gets everyone sort of fired up. Steve-O in the early days was very much an old school director, like, this is how we're going to do it. And then in the latter part, it was more of treating the riders as shareholders. So you're talking about one guy in the team of 8 or 9. How do you collectively bond together those other 7 or 8 to buy into pretty much 3 weeks of suffering but concentration?
Yeah, that process, I think, starts a long time before you get to the race. And what happens is, you've got an athlete that can win a Grand Tour or finish on the podium in the Grand Tour, and it's about just bringing those guys together, keeping them connected. And this is much easier to do than it used to be, because now a lot of them, they live in Girona in Spain, or a lot of them living in Andorra now, so they can train regularly to get together. So what becomes really important in those situations is having the leader who can finish on the podium, but then having a couple of collective individuals around that leader who bring confidence to the situation. And it's really because in any stressful situation, you need to have confidence in the leadership. And through all great social depressions, or you take the current situation we are in now with COVID-19, for example, I think nobody in the States has confidence in the way Donald Trump's going about his handling of the whole situation. And you compare that with what's going on here with New Zealand with Jacinda Ardern. Like, people felt really exposed, but because of her nature and the way that she handles herself, she's got those sort of leadership qualities that in these situations are really, really ideal. And she's been able to keep things under control. She's been able to get a nation who at the time only had, I think not even 100, only over 100 sort of cases go into lockdown already, with that sort of sense of giving the people the confidence that this was the right thing. And this is exactly what you need in the same situation with Simon as well, is just someone there that's just a strong figurehead that can be that confidence booster for the team. Not even a booster really, but just has confidence in the whole process.
Stepping back even further, one of the most unbelievable things I reckon I saw in the entire time in the team was Matty Hayman's win in Roubaix. How much of an influence has he been on a lot of these younger guys, and even the story in itself of what he was able to pull off in that one race?
Yeah, I think one of the awesome things, specifically for Matt Hayman, was he was always well regarded in professional cycling before that time. And he was always there or thereabouts. But I think, it elevated him, I think, to a level where he was able to gain easily so much more respect from everybody, and it wasn't, you're not just by being able to pull that win off in Roubaix, especially for some of these younger guys that we've got coming in now. And I think this will even be more effective the further we get down the track, is, in 10 years or 15 years time, these young guys coming through won't specifically remember too much of the history of Matt Hayman, but they will remember that one race. And, his respect and legacy is there for all of us now. Even if, I think, in this generation that we're in now, even if he hadn't have won Roubaix, his respect would have been the same. But I think for him, and certainly whichever organisation he works for going forward, in 10 years' time or 15 years' time, that's just going to be a massive game changer to have someone like him in the organisation. Not only because of that, but because he is a good leader and he is a good individual to have in any organisation.
He's another growing example of a rider that transitions straight into becoming a DS. How hard is that transition from when you hang up the wheels and you're no longer a professional rider? And how did you find it?
It was challenging, and I was probably fortunate that I was able to go with Orica Greenedge, or as it is now, Mitchelton-Scott, through that transition. I always said I never wanted to be a sport director.
Why is that?
I just didn't really think that they had any great influence on any of the outcomes. Which I think...
I think it's a fair point, because I think you look at coaches, if a team doesn't perform well, who's the first person to get sacked in most other codes? It's the coach. If a team doesn't deliver in cycling, there's not a lot of directors that get the chop based on that performance. It's the rider. So does that leave any sort of reasons why that they probably don't have as much influence?
Yeah, that's definitely part of it. And I still believe that to a large degree, that obviously there's the organizational side of stuff, which I knew nothing about when I retired as a rider and came onto the management side. And that's obviously a massive logistical challenge. When you think, you've got bikes from 28 riders at the service course and 3 races going on at once, and you've got to get people in bikes and everyone to the right races. That's a massive part of it, especially. But once you're out on the road, and this is sort of one of the things that I am really conscious of as a sport director, those guys have got to make the final decision about, because they know what's going on out on the road. Yes, I'm there, I'm in the car, I've got race radios, I've got rider information, but they're actually still there, and they have a much better sense than I'll ever have sitting in a car. I'm really conscious that when I'm sitting in the car, trying to feel what it's like, and I was a rider, but it's really hard, and I always try to keep that in mind, and know the guys that I've got in my team that can make those decisions and will make good decisions. And what they need mostly is good information and reliable information.
So you've got the examples, obviously, yourself, Matty Heyman, guys that retire that go straight into a role that's still involved with the sport. What about the guys that only can identify as a cyclist? They retire, they go back to, you need to find a job, or you need to do something else, because, not everyone's at the higher echelon. There are some guys that, might be domestiques or whatever. How difficult is that transition, and does the sport do enough to assist these guys in transitioning to other ventures?
Yeah, I think, cycling, once you retire, you're basically left to your own, to fend for yourself, really. And cycling's hard, because, why, the top guys do earn a lot of money. Most of the guys, they earn good money, but they're still going to have to get themselves a job and go on and do something, So it's sort of, cycling doesn't really do anything for riders, obviously. There's no program in place, and teams, like I was fortunate enough with Orica at the time, they do have opportunities, open up doors and opportunities if they see that you're going to fit. But, when you have a lot of guys retiring all the time, there's not that many opportunities every year for that. But I think what I really learnt going through the process myself, and from speaking to Matty Heyman when he retired, and and actually when I retired as well, I went and talked to a lot of other athletes. I talked to Rob Waddell, who was a Olympic rower. I talked to Sarah Ulmer, who was a Olympic champion as well.
When you say you talk to these people, what do you ring up and say? Hey, it's Julian Dean here. I've just hung up the boots. What the fuck?
Idiot! You're screwed. You don't know what you got yourself into. See you in the loony bin.
What are some of the things you wanted to get out of him, and what did you get?
I think probably, I guess my initial approach, when I called a guy like Rob Waddell, who was, I think he was Olympic gold medalist in Atlanta in rowing, single sculls, or Sydney it was, I think. and he was working at the time with the New Zealand Olympic Committee. Sarah was working for Cycling New Zealand. She's obviously quite high profile in New Zealand, as she was around the world at the time. But I think probably I thought, oh, if I'm stopped cycling, I've got to maintain connections and call these people up. And I thought I was going to get something out of it in terms of a career possibly, or a network or something. I don't know what I was thinking at the time. I think probably, actually what it was going back was I was talking to them about when they retired more than anything. And what actually happens is most people are forced into retirement. So there's not what I call the Richie McCaw retirement package, where you go out having been captain of the All Blacks for 15 odd years and one of the most capped All Blacks of all time, and you go walk out holding the stadium, holding the Webb Ellis Trophy over your head. That, I reckon, of all the people that you hear about, there's probably 1% that retire under those circumstances. But I think every athlete wants to, that's their dream, to stop under those sort of conditions. And I had that same dream when Greenedge started in 2012. I felt like I was ready to retire. I wanted to race one more Tour de France with Greenedge. I wanted to finish with the Olympics. And that's how I was going to retire, But I had this is a whole nother episode, but had a dodgy start to the year with a crash, and then a real bad crash in Volta Catalunya in March, broke my leg. It was at the point where I wasn't going to be able to race again. I came back, missed the Tour de France, missed the Olympics, came back and raced the Vuelta that year. And then I was like, oh, do I go on and try and get that ultimate retirement? But actually what you start to realise when I talk to people like Rob Waddell, who had heart condition, he had to stop, with Sarah, had back issues, no one actually goes on to be able to, not no one, a very small percentage of people actually go on to be able to retire how they want to retire. And it almost ends up, you'd be like chasing a rainbow, So at some point you've just got to go, boom, that's it, I've got to move on. So to go back to your question, which I think was, do they do enough? Well, I think it comes back to, there does have to be a certain amount of responsibility. And, I think teams, I know certainly in our team, we've done what we can to help guys out over the years. But I'd say that, many of the problems in our sport, I think, lie with lack of thought and lack of diversity in our organisations. And, certainly athlete welfare post cycling career is probably one of those areas where if there's going to be change, that also needs to be improved.
I want to sort of wrap up the chat. It's been bloody interesting, mate. I've loved every minute of it, but I want to sort of bring it on a higher note, and I want to finish it around culture. Obviously, you've had a big part to play in the establishing of the culture within Greenedge, along with yourself, Whitey, Jerry, Shane Bannon, the riders in the early days. What has been the keys to the culture that you want to set up in that organisation that has really worked, you think?
Like culture, it's an interesting one, because it's such a thing that people talk about,
it's an obsession. It's an obsession in business, in sport. Everyone wants to know, what are the little 1%ers we can do? All right, get a broom and let's sweep out the change rooms, and we'll start winning some games. But as you said, it's case by case. But I mean, what are the things that you've reckoned worked for you guys?
Look, if I go back and just speaking from personal experiences and what, there's starting a team, and when you start a team, you automatically create a culture, right? That's gonna be there. Yep. And I think in the two teams that I've been startups on, one was Garmin back in the day, it was Slipstream, and then Greenedge, obviously. But it's the key thing is in those startups is to get it right from the beginning. You have to get it right from the beginning, because to change things later on is really, really difficult. And to sort of, if I take back, probably the Garmin situation to start with, cycling was in need of change at the time. The whole Lance Armstrong saga was starting to expose itself. People had doubts about the history of people's performances and the like.
Well, just on that, was it Garmin that started independent testing that created the biological passport that initiated from those guys?
Yes. So one of the things that that we did was in Garmin was complete transparency, right? So we wanted everything, instead of the secret buses and not letting people know what athletes are up to. We started our own internal testing programs, and those results were published. And it was a pain in the ass, man, because we would get. So the team invested in paying a drug testing agency, which I guess technically doesn't make it totally external, but it was a ethically approved testing laboratory, and they would do tests on us, and they could, like WADA can do now, or SADA can do now, they can come and test you anytime. So, like some mornings at a race or some mornings at home, I'd have two people from different agencies come to the house for testing. But what that was about...
Why didn't you say, hey, bro, split the piss?
I'm not a gainer.
Double dip on the chip. That is a pain in the ass.
Yeah, but what that was about was it was recognition from those people that were the core of that organisation that things needed to be different a little bit, and we need to do things a bit differently, and that's sort of what that was about. And I guess
that would have been harder to do 3 years in, as opposed to kicking things off with that transparency. Yeah,
that's right. Because this is, obviously teams, riders come and go, and staff members come and go, but there's always sort of that core turnover, that little bit left over from the group before, and that's why we say, these things about culture are really, really important. And that's why Jerry's really big on culture. I think in his example with Jayco Caravans, it started as a family small enterprise, and he's been able to hold on to that core value and grow it into the massive multinational company that it is. And he sees that as really important because he's been through that process. In Green Edge's case, in the beginning, I think that was really easy to implement because the likes of O'Grady and McEwen and Lancaster, Whitey, myself, Steve-O, we'd all been in professional cycling for 20 odd years, and it'd always been a dream of ours to have our own team where we had our own Australasian type culture. And whatever that is, I don't know. We don't know what culture is. Is it because you can tell your own jokes and other people will get them?
I think the guts was work hard, but don't take yourself too serious. Take your job serious, but don't take yourselves too serious. Was that sort of the guts of it?
Yeah, I think so. Like I just think that a lot of that was actually you just a little bit more relaxed. When you can communicate with someone on your own native level.
Could you go to dinner tables at races where other teams had the leaders jersey and the riders weren't talking to themselves? Our team, I think we got kicked in the teeth at the tour that year, and there's that massive crash, and I think we had like 4 or 5 riders. Our guys are pissing themselves, laughing, enjoying themselves. It doesn't mean they're not working hard. It means that there's a culture there where they actually, it's one thing to be put into a situation where you have to race together, but if you could generally choose to race with these guys, you probably would as well, because you're mates as well.
Yeah, that's right. And it's interesting because, this, this sort of sense of sharing humor, sort of away from your work, that goes back, like a long time. And there's a book that some people may have read or may not have read, called Gates of Fire, about the Spartan 300, and their training, and they used to bury these guys into the ground for their training, make them do all sorts of shit. And then they'd make them sit around and laugh, and just share humor. And I think when you get reduced down to the core of humanity, and especially men, like we don't know, and this sort of goes back, also think, watching my kid going to a boys' school, when you're working with a bunch of men all the time, or you're around men, we don't really have many ways to connect, we're not into giving each other hugs.
After midnight. After midnight, yeah.
But like our natural tendencies, we don't really tend to talk things out, but we can share stuff through humor. And if I look back at especially the culture of Greenedge or Mitchelton-Scott now, and this still happens to this day, like at the table, the guys will have finished dinner and they'll sit around and they'll be laughing their asses off, And I really think that at the core of it, as hard as cycling is, it's definitely still one of the hardest sports that you'll come across. But that capacity to be able to sit down and have a laugh and create those connections, which is what that's what humans are hardwired to do, is to create connections. That was always going to spill over and have a positive influence on every other aspect of everything you do, whether it's sort of out on the bike or whether it's a long trip in a car or whatever.
You're talking earlier about Jacinda Ardern, and in times of crisis, she gives this level of calm to everyone. How important has Shane Bannon been to that organisation in terms of, it could be in the background, the most stressful bomb going off, yet he projects this face of calm and never projects that onto the rest of the organisation. If it was me as a general manager, I'd be terrible, because the slightest bit of stress, I just dump it onto everyone else.
Yeah, I think one of the I think Shane he's definitely amazing like that. He can hold in. There's obviously a lot going on, especially in those early years with the Whitey situation, and then those thugs from the team that got in that fight in Paris that time. And
it's another podcast, mate.
That's a good story.
That's Greenedge Uncut for another time there, Jules. That was a good story, though.
Yeah. So there's been, lots of incidences over, especially in the beginning, that Shane's had to deal with. And the Simon Yates one was another one, where there was that positive drug test.
Yeah. I felt, that was just a real shit situation all around that one. And Simon could have easily said to the team, stick it up your ass, like, I feel like there was a duty of care there. I felt a bit shafted. But obviously the way the team handled it, and that, getting back to what you're saying, there's been a lot of stuff that they've had to deal with and a lot of shit.
Yeah. And I guess, like Shane's quality, like any good leader's quality, that, and I think, the fact that Shane's been around for 8 years is kudos to him. Anyone that's been at the helm of these organisations for any length of time has done a good job. And it's always his capacity, I think, to be able to let people know enough of what's going on, to give them that little bit of confidence, because what we were talking about before, people need that confidence to be able to move forward. Enough of that information, and just internalizing or dealing with it in the way that he has to deal with it, with some of the negative stuff that's going on, and I can't imagine what it's like for him constantly trying to recruit sponsors and sell the team, which he's been hard at for 8 years.
Regarding yourself, you've obviously had to deal with a lot of stressful situations over the time as a rider, as a director. How do you deal with stress, Jules? And obviously we're coming into a pretty stressful period now for a lot of people. What are some of the tips that you can give people to get through a difficult period?
That's a hard one there, James.
Come on, mate. Just give me a quick fire answer.
No, look,
I'm stressing out about this COVID shit. Help me out.
Look, I think it doesn't matter. I think we started off with different personalities, the introvert personality and extrovert personality. But it doesn't matter what kind of personality you are. You need connection, and you need to be in touch with people, because that's what we're hardwired to do. And whether that's raising your kids, whether that's talking with your teammates or whatever. And I would just encourage people in these sorts of times just to do whatever it takes. Get on Zoom. And if I'm bad, I think, I should call this guy and I should call that dude. I'll be good to touch base with him. But I've actually been trying to make an effort during this period to use some of the time that we've got on our hands actually to make that call. Because I'm certainly, as my mate Josie, I'm not always the best at keeping in touch. But I think in these sorts of times, those connections are probably the most important thing you got.
Yeah. Well, you've taken the time to join us on Backstage, mate, and I really appreciate it. It's been a fascinating chat, and we're going to have to check in again, mate. And what I'll do is I'll jot down about a dozen of the world's problems, and I reckon we can solve them in about 60 minutes flat.
That'll be easy for us, mate. Then we have time for a drink afterwards.
Yeah, for sure. But no, it's obviously, we were talking earlier, it's a stressful period for the world of cycling and so forth. So fingers crossed that the smoke clears, mate, and we'll definitely check in again soon and see how you're traveling. And appreciate all the insights, mate. It's been fantastic. And maybe the next one we'll launch that Green Edge Uncut, and we'll just do clickbait stories for first 20 minutes at least anyway.
Yeah, and mate, there's one thing that when things get tough, mate, and you're out there and you're doing it, and it is mounting up. I had a good mate of mine once, mate, and he just told me to enjoy myself. So that's my go-to these days. Just enjoy yourself.
Yeah, I reckon that was our catchphrase for many a Tour de France, particularly in that last week when the WhatsApp groups have been going red hot and people are whinging about, me bloody clothes hadn't been dry. Oh, whatever, mate. Just enjoy yourself.
Yeah,
I think
that's right.
Kept us saying that whole period, and yeah, it's a good message.
Yeah, it is, mate. Yep, and one to live by.
All right, Jules. Thanks again, mate. I really appreciate it, and we'll speak again soon. Say good day to Carol and the kids.
Will do, mate. Cheers, mate. Catch you.